This is a Pulp archive recording. All public Pulp archive recordings are licensed under Creative Commons. For more information or to support us, please visit patreon.com/pulparchive. This episode was prepared by Soul and narrated by Whiteman, the digital narrator. The Dark Brown Dress by Meredith Beyers. The Black Mask, December 1921. This episode contains period-typical depictions of crime, violence, and mild profanity. Listener discretion is advised. This story begins with the tale, one Henry Grover told Moreau before 7 in the morning, after I had ushered him into the room. We had never seen him before. He was bald, with the exception of a curious and rather ugly strip of black hair at the back of his head. His eyebrows were heavy and black, and above the left one there was a mole with a long hair growing out of it, which seemed to bother the eye beneath. He tilted back his head to gaze at us from under half-closed lids, which seemed too heavy to raise themselves. His face was smooth and molded with odd lines about the mouth. "I have a room on the 6th floor of the Buckminster, facing south," he said. "My desk makes an angle with the window, and I sit so the light comes from the left and a little behind. By slightly turning my head, I can see the face of the Claridge across the rather narrow street. Now you must have observed, Mr. Merrow, that it is unpleasant to be stared at, that there is something distressingly tangible about it, even when you are not aware of the owner or the location of the eyes which are staring at you. This feeling came to me yesterday afternoon. I looked hastily about the room. My door was closed, and I was alone. I looked out of the window. Opposite stretched the windows of the 6th floor of the Claridge. Every 10 yards was a set of bay windows. Not directly opposite, but just 3 or 4 windows to the right, was the third of these sets. There I glanced, instinctively, and rather furtively, trying to conceal the fact. In the side window was the back of a settee. Beyond this, I saw a rather stout and elderly woman with slightly gray hair and a dark brown dress, sitting motionless in a rocking chair and staring at me. This annoyed me so that I resolved to outstare her. I turned my chair slightly and directed a defiant glare, which I held for perhaps 30 seconds before I discovered that she had not been looking at me at all. She took absolutely no notice of my action, laughing at myself. I attempted once more to resume my writing, but again felt the irresistible impulse to turn my eyes. Still the steady stare. Then for the first time I noticed something just above the back of the left end of the settee. It was the head of a man. The confused reflections at that part of the window had prevented me from distinguishing him before. Of course, I thought to myself, the man was undoubtedly talking to her, and she was listening very attentively. But my train of thoughts had been wrecked, and work was useless. So I put on my hat and went out for a walk. It was nearly supper time, so I went downtown to my favorite restaurant. On the way home I stopped, as is my custom, at the public library. It was late when I returned to bed. As I opened my window, I noticed that the bay window was dark, and presumed, of course, that the man and woman had retired. Now, I am an early riser, sir. I very often do 2 or 3 hours' work before breakfast. Here, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and mopped his head. "Mr. Merrow," he said strangely and evidently quite carried away with a vivid memory, "this morning I commenced to write as usual. Soon came the first light of dawn. I kept on writing. Then it grew lighter and I turned off the desk lamp and, dear God, man," he said hoarsely. I looked out of the window and there she was, that woman, still staring at me. And the head of the man was above the back of the settee in exactly the same position. I leaned forward with a glance at Merrow. "And what did you do, Mr. Grover?" he was asking. "I went directly over to the Claridge, sir, but the janitor said that I was, crazy, and would not listen to me. What's more, he would not let me in to wake up the manager, so I returned to my room to make sure that I had not been dreaming. Being perfectly satisfied that this was not the case, I decided to appeal to you. If you will come directly to my room, I am confident that you will find things just as I have stated." And it is your opinion, Mr. Grover, that a crime has been committed? Why, yes. Well, that of course is one possibility. Come, said Merrill, putting the screen in front of the fireplace. We will go immediately. Once in the room, Grover advanced quickly to the window and uttered an exclamation of astonishment. For the room behind the third bay window opposite was the scene of a commotion. Moreau bolted for the door with the two of us at his heels. The office of the Claridge was empty, not waiting to ring for the elevator. Moreau rushed up 6 flights of stairs. I followed him, leaving Grover blustering and far behind. We made our way toward the sound of voices down the hall and stood in the doorway of a room facing a dozen or more people. Moreau showed them his badge of authority. Mr. Barhart, manager of the hotel, stood forth as the main spokesman. I was surprised to find that all in the room were alive and on their feet, and noticed that Moreau was also somewhat disturbed at this. Where are the bodies? He asked, addressing Mr. Barhart, who seemed rather astounded that Moreau had arrived upon the scene and could not quite understand how he had known that there were bodies in the case when he himself had just discovered them. Why, we carried them to the bed in the other room, he replied, and sent for the house doctor. Has he been here? He has examined them, sir. In fact, he is still in the room with them. Were they dead? Apparently quite lifeless. Then you should not have removed them until the arrival of the proper authorities, Mr. Barhart. Have you notified the police? The police? Mr. Barhart was quite taken aback. It had not occurred to me that there was need to notify the police. I was about to notify the friends of these people and arrange with the undertaker. Then it had not occurred to you, Mr. Barhart, that a crime had been committed? There was a murmuring of voices among the assembly at the end of the room, among which were guests of the hotel, 2 or 3 maids, the elevator boy, and the telephone girl. A crime, exclaimed the manager. These unfortunate people have been ill. 15 minutes ago, a telegram came from Mr. Brintor, and as they did not answer the phone, I myself came up to see what was the matter. I found them dead, Mrs. Brentor, in the chair here, and Mr. Brentor on the settee by the window. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw that Grover had caught up with us and was standing in the doorway. What was the doctor's verdict? Asked Moreau of Barhart at this point. That they both had died of heart trouble, perhaps after having eaten a very heavy meal, he replied. Oh, but they were not present in the dining room at dinner time, interrupted one of the guests. Moreau beckoned to Grover. Mr. Barhart, this man occupies a room on the 6th floor of the Buckminster, very nearly opposite these windows. Yesterday afternoon he saw Mr. and Mrs. Brentor in the positions in which you have informed me they were found this morning. Early this morning he saw them in the same position. He rushed here to notify you. Your janitor laughed at him, called him crazy, and refused to let him wake you. I am sorry, Mr. Barhart, but I will have to ask all of you to remain in this room until I have investigated the situation a little more closely. The telephone girl stepped forward and held up her hand. Lee Harmon, the janitor, has disappeared, she said. He was seen by Miss Luigi, the night operator, at about 6. Shortly after that, there was a call for him about a water fixture, but he was not to be found. Just then the doctor stepped forth from the bedroom. These gentlemen are here under the impression that a crime has been committed, said Barhart, with a sweep of the hand toward the 3 of us. And perhaps we are wrong, said Grover with his rasping voice. I was the one who suggested the idea. I was very suspicious and consulted Mr. Moreau immediately, knowing that he, if anyone, could shed light on the subject. But perhaps I was over-hasty. Yes, perhaps I was over-hasty. There is every evidence of a natural death, said the doctor. You are sure there were no marks of violence? Asked Moreau. Absolutely, Mr. Moreau. I have examined the bodies very carefully. Besides, they were found in a peaceful position, one in the chair and one on the settee. This would hardly indicate a death by violence. No, the deaths were undoubtedly caused by heart failure, although I am at a loss to know the exact nature of this heart failure. There is a total lack of other indications. "Does it not strike you as odd, doctor," said Moreau, "that the two deaths should have occurred simultaneously?" "At first, yes, but on second thought, no," he replied. "They were both in a weak condition, and in sitting and conversing with each other, as was evidently the case. If one were to die suddenly, it would not be unnatural for the shock of the discovery to cause heart failure in the other." Moreau shook his head doubtfully. "And you are absolutely certain that they were not poisoned?" he asked. "No, I am not absolutely certain that they were not poisoned," was the reply. "But I will assist in performing an autopsy this morning if you wish." "Please make arrangements to do that," said Moreau, "and I will notify the coroner at once. And by the way, Mr. Barhart informs me that Mr. and Mrs. Brentor had been ill. May I ask what was the nature of that illness?" "That I do not know, Mr. Moreau. Although I am the house doctor, Mr. and Mrs. Brentor were in the habit of consulting a doctor by the name of Kramer. I know nothing about him other than his name and his distinctly odd personal appearance." Moreau turned to the gathering at the end of the room. "Is there testimony to be volunteered illustrative of the case as it stands?" he asked. "Does anyone know where Dr. Kramer may be found?" "I have heard Mrs. Brentor call Dr. Kramer on the phone," said the telephone girl. "He lives at the Braymore." "When was Dr. Kramer last seen in this building?" "He passed through the office to the elevator yesterday afternoon," she answered. "I took him up to this floor, sir," said the elevator boy. Then an elderly woman stepped forward. "My rooms are across the hall," she said, "and I saw him enter the room. It was about 4 o'clock, and how long did he remain here, I do not know. But later in the afternoon, shortly after 5, I saw the janitor come out of Mrs. Brentor's room. I thought nothing of it at the time, but perhaps it will prove to have some bearing on the matter, now that the janitor is supposed to have disappeared." "I am quite sure that it will have a bearing," said Moreau. "And now, Mr. Barhart, may I please see the telegram which caused you to seek entrance to these rooms this morning?" Moreau read the message which Mr. Barhart handed him, and then dismissed all except Barhart and Grover. As the gathering dispersed, Moreau led me into the bedroom to examine the bodies. They were stretched side by side upon the bed, under a sheet. The clothing was on a chair. I thought I heard Moreau utter an exclamation as he held up the dress of the woman. Then he turned to the bodies. The skin of each of them was ashy pale, and the lips were almost a pale slate color. "It is hard to believe that they died of heart failure," I whispered. "It appears to me that the doctor and Mr. Barhart are very much interested in proving that a crime has not been committed." Moreau did not answer. He was on his way to the phone to notify the coroner. When he returned, he proceeded to examine the bodies very minutely from head to foot. Once he poked me and pointed to the lower arm of the woman near the elbow. "It looks like a needle prick," I whispered. Moreau then went over the arms of the man very carefully, but found nothing. Suddenly he poked me again and pointed to the man's left leg. There was the same little mark that looked like a needle prick. "Do you think they have been poisoned?" I whispered. "The coroner will soon find out," he answered. And then we joined Mr. Grover and Mr. Barhart, who had remained in the sitting room of the suite. Moreau sat down to examine the contents of the desk. I saw him put an envelope in his pocket. "Mr. Barhart," said Moreau, "what can you tell me of this janitor?" "Lee Harmon, who was seen to depart from this room yesterday afternoon, who would not permit Mr. Grover to notify you of his suspicions this morning, and who has since disappeared." "I know absolutely nothing about him, Mr. Moreau, except that we have employed him for little more than a month." "Did he come to you with recommendations?" "His only recommendation was from— well now, that's funny. It hadn't struck me before. His only recommendation was from Dr. Kramer." "Huh, I see. Well, how long have Mr. and Mrs. Brentor been guests at the Claridge?" 3 years this next month." "And how long has Dr. Kramer been attending them?" "Just this fall before that. I do not believe they were in need of medical advice. If so, it did not come under my observation." And Mr. and Mrs. Brentor were quite wealthy? Very wealthy, Mr. Merrow. As soon as the coroner arrives, Mr. Barhart, I will leave to make some further investigations of my own. I will return at 2 o'clock. Please see that all the available witnesses are present. And you are still of the opinion that a crime has been committed, Mr. Merrow? I would rather not answer that, Mr. Barhart, until I have received the coroner's statement. And, Mr. Grover, there is nothing to keep you now, but inasmuch as you are one of the chief witnesses, I shall ask you to be present at 2 this afternoon. Really, you know, he rasped. Perhaps I have been over hasty. I would not wish to be the cause of unnecessary trouble by suggesting that a crime had been committed when you were certainly the early bird this time, Mr. Merrow, chuckled a voice in the doorway. It was the coroner. Chapter 2. At the office of the Braymore, which was next door to the Buckminster, Merrow made inquiries about Dr. Kramer. He had occupied room number 75 on the 7th floor for 2 months, was not seen very often, was in the habit of spending long hours, sometimes days, in his room with the door locked, and had been known to refuse to answer messages or telephone calls. They knew nothing whatsoever of his practice, were not even sure that he possessed one. The last seen of him was the afternoon before, when he had returned to his room after having been away for 2 or 3 hours. There was an automatic elevator in the Braymore, which we took to the 7th floor. We knocked at the door of room 75, but there was no answer. We tried to open it, but it was locked. Merrow called a maid. Dr. Kramer does not permit us to enter his room unless he calls us, sir, she said, but handed him the passkey. The door was bolted from the inside and would not open. I think, said Merrow, that we can get in through the window if you will let us into a room that opens onto the roof of the Buckminster. There is no space between the 2 buildings. He was not mistaken. After climbing out of room 72, we encircled a small court and came to the window of Dr. Kramer's room, which was closed but unfastened. Inside, there was nothing, absolutely nothing, belonging to Dr. Kramer. The drawers were open, and crumpled paper littered the floor as if he had packed very hurriedly. So Dr. Kramer has disappeared too, muttered Merrill. Outside, Merrow handed me the telegram which had been sent to Mr. Brentor. It was from Bradlenook, New Jersey, and dated November 29th. Evidently, you did not receive the former telegram. It read, Latimer disappeared 4 months ago, in face of heavy debts. Advise, you retract will immediately. It was signed R. Goodnow. Harding is their lawyer, said Merrow, drawing from his pocket the envelope he had found in Brentor's desk. If you will wire R. Goodnow of the death of Mr. and Mrs. Brentor, I will run up to see Harding and tend to 1 or 2 other matters. Then we will meet at Marston's at 12:30 for a bite of lunch before ending this curious little story about the woman in a dark brown dress who stared at Henry Grover. There was an odd smile on Merrow's face, but before I could speak, he was striding down the street away from me. Chapter 3. Shortly before 12:30, I seated myself in the lobby of Marston's to wait for Merrow. At 12:55, he came through the door as if he had been hurrying. His brows were puckered and he appeared distressed. What news? I asked. That there were absolutely no traces of poison, he replied, leading me quickly to a table in the corner. Then the whole thing is a farce. I mean, about the crime part of it. What about the janitor and Kramer? What about Barhart and the house doctor? But Merrow did not answer. After giving our order, he leaned back in his chair with his chin sunk to his chest in deep thought. There is not much time, he said. I must make some sort of a showing at 2 o'clock, or the reputation of a year's hard work will be seriously injured. Not that I really care, he added with a curious light in his eyes and a slow shaking of the head. What did you find out from Harding? I asked. But again he was lost in thought and did not hear me. We ate in silence, then we sat in silence. I looked at my watch. It was after 1:30. Suddenly Merrow leaned over to touch my arm. Do you remember, he asked slowly, if those needle pricks were directly over one of the large veins? No, I answered. No, I did not think to notice. It all hinges upon that, he said. Let us go. We arrived at the Claridge a moment before 2. The elevator boy was waiting for us. They are all upstairs, he said. As we approached the door to the room, I could see that indeed they were all within, all who had been present in the morning. At the side of the door was Larkin from headquarters. He stepped down the hall to meet us. They tell me, Mr. Moreau, he remarked dryly, that you are attempting to build a murder out of a case of heart failure. Perhaps, smiled Moreau, making his way through the door and past the assembly into the bedroom. He was followed with curious eyes. In a moment, he appeared again. There was a blank expression on his face as he looked at the coroner. The bodies have been removed, Mr. Moreau, he was informed. Are they with Jordan? Yes, then I must phone Jordan. As Moreau disappeared, there was a great murmur of voices. Upon his return, he stepped behind the table where the coroner, Barhart, Grover, and the house doctor were seated. I will begin, said Moreau, by telling you what I have been able to discover about Mr. and Mrs. Brentor, the deceased. They were a lonely, childless couple, at one time poor. 5 years ago, Mr. Brentor came into sudden wealth through interest in an African diamond project. He had originally been a jeweler of no great repute, forced to struggle to make ends meet. 3 years ago, he sold his business and retired with his wife to this suite at the Claridge, intending to live there until old age overtook them, which they did not expect would be very many years. The nearest relative to either of them was an elder sister of Mr. Brentor, who died in Brattlenook, New Jersey, leaving a grown son by the name of Roderick Latimer. Of the character of this man I will not venture to speak, other than that he took a great interest in the suddenly acquired fortune of his uncle Brentor, whom he had never seen. One day, a man by the name of Dr. Kramer registered at the Hotel Braemore. He was from Brattlenook, New Jersey. He called upon Mr. and Mrs. Brentor, telling them that their nephew Roderick Latimer was one of his best friends and had asked him to visit them. Mr. Brentor was immediately interested, for he had often wished to know more about this nephew than he had heard from his sister before her death. One evening Dr. Kramer called again and found Mrs. Brentor indisposed. He volunteered his services, saying that he had given up his practice upon leaving Brattlenook, but would be very glad to render service to either of them at any time it might be needed. Curiously enough, Mr. and Mrs. Brentor, from then on, became more and more in need of these services. Their health began to fail as time went on. There came a thought which very often comes to men of failing health, who are burdened with wealth. They had not made a will, perhaps. Yes, perhaps this was even suggested by Dr. Kramer. At least they talked together about this nephew who was Brentor's only relative. A decision was at hand, but he was evidently not satisfied with second-hand knowledge of this Latimer from someone who had been a stranger until so recently. There was an old boyhood friend of Mr. Brentor's living in Brattlenook. His name was Goodnow. He telegraphed Goodnow asking him to look up Latimer and report results by wire. This was done, and the report received by Brentor was favorable, so he made an appointment with Harding of the Mentor Building to draw up the will. Then he telegraphed Goodnow to inform Latimer of what he had done, and to ask him, Latimer, to come at his earliest opportunity, at Brentor's expense, for a short visit here at the Claridge. That was yesterday. Goodnow sent a night letter to Brentor, which arrived this morning, in attempting to ensure that Mr. Brentor received this message. Mr. Barhart discovered both Mr. and Mrs. Brentor dead. I will read you the message. Evidently you did not receive the former telegram. Latimer disappeared 4 months ago in the face of heavy debts. Advice: you retract will immediately. Now, Brentor had received a favorable report, apparently from Goodnow, so you see the unfavorable telegram had been intercepted and the favorable one substituted. I found from Western Union that the correct telegram left their office. At this point, let me remind you that Dr. Kramer was seen to enter this room yesterday afternoon at 4. The janitor, who had come here a month ago with only Dr. Kramer's recommendation, was seen leaving this room at about 5. This morning it was discovered that the janitor had disappeared, and since then I have discovered something that may interest you. Dr. Kramer has also disappeared from his quarters at the Braemore." There was a murmuring at this, and Merrill waited for it to subside before he continued. "Much of the information not obtainable here at the Claridge I gathered from Franks Harding, the lawyer engaged to draw up the will. Some of it I inferred as necessary to make the tale coherent. And now we will approach what I still choose to consider a mystery from another angle. It has to do with Henry Grover here, who came to me at 6:30 this morning, over half an hour before Mr. Barhart entered the room. Mr. Grover occupies a room directly opposite this one at the Buckminster. He came to me rather distressed because, yesterday afternoon at 5 or a little after, he was disturbed by the figure of a woman with slightly gray hair and a dark brown dress staring at him from this room. Soon he discovered that she was not staring at him, but at a man who was evidently talking to her and whose head he could see above the back of the settee in the window. It had bothered him so much that he stopped work and went out for a walk. He remained for supper and did not return until dark. Not seeing a light in this window, he presumed that the occupants had retired for the night. But early this morning he discovered them in exactly the same position, the position in which they were found later by Mr. Barhart rushing over to the Claridge. He was stopped by the janitor, who laughed at him, called him crazy, and refused to allow him to wake up the manager. Not long after this, the janitor disappeared. Mr. Grover came to me at 6:30, told me the story, and requested that I accompany him to his room to see for myself. When we arrived, we found that the situation had already been discovered, so we made our way to the scene as quickly as possible. At first my suspicions were aroused by the reluctance of the house doctor and Mr. Barhart to even remotely consider that a crime had been committed. I have since come to the conclusion that it was merely a natural instinct on the part of those interested in the business end of the establishment to avoid encroaching upon its good name. There was a slight bow of acknowledgment from Barhart. It surprised me greatly to be informed that there were absolutely no indications of death other than natural causes. So I examined the bodies myself and found what would be easy to overlook. Marks that I had every reason to suspect were from a hypodermic needle. There was one on the arm of the woman and one on the leg of the man. I was therefore doubly surprised and disconcerted when the coroner informed me that there were absolutely no traces of drug or poison. Things had come to my notice which left no doubt in my mind that the whole thing was a very clever conspiracy or plot, but the whole framework of my theory would fall apart if Mr. and Mrs. Brentor had died a natural death. It all depended on one fact. When I rushed to the bedroom a while ago, it was to verify this. The bodies were gone. I called Jordan and asked him to look for the needle marks and tell me if they were situated over a large vein. His answer was yes. Now, is it not true, doctor, that if air is introduced into a large vein, it may be carried in the venous circulation to the right ventricle and then be forced by the systole of the latter into the pulmonary artery or its primary branches, acting like a clot, possibly even producing a clot? It is, Mr. Moreau, that would be what is termed an air embolism. It would have somewhat the same effect as phlebitis of a large vein, and it would produce death. It would. And the face and surface of the victim would be ashy pale with the lips and mucous membrane a pale slate color, as was the case with the bodies in question. Either that or the face would be livid and bluish, and in some cases the limbs are convulsed. And there was nothing in your examination of these bodies that contradicts my statement that death was caused by the introduction of air into a large vein by means of an empty or partially empty hypodermic needle, thus leaving the marks which I discovered on examining the bodies this morning. Nothing, Mr. Moreau. It is a thing which had not occurred to me before in relation to this particular case. It is only in exceptional cases that there are any distinctive signs to be found on physical examination. And how long after the introduction of the air would death occur? Death might take place in a very few moments, not due to mere asphyxia, but in some degree to syncope. Now, with the doctor's word in support of my theory, said Moreau, turning to the others, I advanced the tentative hypothesis that Mr. and Mrs. Brentor were deliberately murdered by the introduction of air into a large vein. Now, as this could not very well be accomplished without their consent, or without dragging them or binding them, I suggest that it was accomplished under the pretext of injecting a medicine for an ailment from which they believed themselves to be suffering at the time. There was a moment's silence. "But could one die such a death, Mr. Marrow?" interrupted the rasping voice of Mr. Grover. "And remain in the natural sitting posture in which I saw them as early as yesterday afternoon, and in which Mr. Barhart found them this morning?" "They could not," answered Marrow, "and for that reason I was about to offer the additional suggestion that, after being successfully murdered in this unusual way, the bodies were placed in a sitting posture as nearly natural as possible, and why it would seem that one would not take the trouble to do this without a perfectly definite and ingeniously conceived purpose. It is this and one other point which have led me to some rather startling conclusions since 7 o'clock this morning. There is in this room at this moment one who will verify all that I am saying. Did it not strike you as suggestive that the lady across the hall should have seen Dr. Kramer enter this room and the janitor depart from it? I leave you to draw your own conclusions from this, and the fact that when one disappears, both disappear, and who would derive the greatest benefit from the death of Mr. and Mrs. Brentor? Would it not certainly be the nephew Roderick Latimer, who disappeared from Brattlenook in the face of heavy debts? Who else would spend weeks of patient labor on a plan to hasten the preparation of the will, and immediately after that the death of these people? At this point, I offer another suggestion. Roderick Latimer, Dr. Kramer, and Lee Harmon, the janitor, are one and the same person. There was another burst of murmuring. A slightly sarcastic smile appeared on Larkin's face. And that, in the person of the janitor, he was able to intercept the telegram, the receipt of which would have ruined his chances of being named in the will. And that, in the person of the doctor, he was able to commit the murder at the proper time and without any great outcry. "Mr. Marrow," said Larkin suddenly, "most of what you have given us, clever and coherent though it is mere theory. Do you have proof of what you say? Can you lead us to the murderer?" "If the case ended at that point, I would not have proof of what I say. I would not be able to lead you to the murderer." But Roderick Latimer did not stop there. He went a step farther. He went a step too far in an effort to protect himself without having to flee the country entirely. He conceived a plan that was too perfect for him to execute without a flaw. He knew that the best way to escape detection and still be on the ground until it was safe for him to resume the character of Roderick Latimer, pay his debts, and take up the life of a wealthy and righteous citizen, was to be right under the nose and on the side of the detector. This would have been very successful had he been the mastermind to think of all the details at once. He was not that perfect mastermind. And now Lee Harmon, Dr. Kramer, Roderick Latimer, and Henry Grover, what have you to say for yourself? Chapter 4. There was a general outcry of astonishment. Henry Grover looked around him, and up at Moreau in utter amazement. Another sarcastic smile appeared on Larkin's face. "You would look more like yourself without that on," said Moreau, reaching for the hairpiece that grew out of the mole above Grover's left eye, but it did not budge. Grover uttered an exclamation of pain and rose in indignation. "Come out of it, Latimer," said Marrow. "It will not help you now to put up a bluff. You came to me at 6:30. You were in a hurry as you accosted the telephone girl at the Charlesgate Club. You are not in a hurry once you would enter my room. You made your story entirely too dramatic to get away with naturally. You described the woman as having slightly gray hair and a dark brown dress. It was when I found that her hair was only slightly gray and that her dress was a very dark brown that I suspected your whole game. I defy anyone to sit in your room at the Buckminster and tell Mrs. Brentor's dark brown dress from a black one while it is hanging over a chair in the center of this room, and it would be equally impossible to recognize her hair as slightly gray without having seen it at very close range. And when I discovered that the window of Kramer's room at the Braemore opened onto the roof of the Buckminster, not far from the stairway leading down to the 6th floor, your floor, I was convinced. Also, you were too eager to retract your suggestion that a crime had been committed after seeing the possibility of its being considered otherwise. Now let's see whether that mole will come off. It doesn't look quite natural to me. Your ideas of disguise are a bit crude for this day and age. I wish I had seen you as Dr. Kramer and the janitor." Grover backed away from Merrow. Suddenly, the coroner reached for the mole. Grover jerked away with another exclamation, but the mole was left behind, held up to view in the coroner's fingers. "Do you deny anything that I have said?" asked Moreau. "Do you deny that you kept a room at both the Braemore and the Buckminster and managed to maintain the appearance of living in both by means of the stairway on the roof? Do you deny that for the past month you have worked yourself to death as Lee Harmon the janitor in order to ensure the success of your little plan?" I felt a real tinge of pity for the man as he hung his head. Suddenly he looked up. "Perhaps it would help clear matters," he said in a strained but quiet voice, "if I showed you exactly what was done in the case. For instance, with the woman." He reached into his hip pocket and drew forth a small box. He removed from it a hypodermic needle. "It was this vein," he said, pointing to his arm with the point of the needle. We watched him with gaping mouths, half stupefied by the strange tones of his voice. Suddenly Moreau lurched toward him, but it was too late. The needle was in his vein, and his thumb was pressing it home. "I would rather not be bothered with the red tape of a trial," he said quietly. I will not describe in detail the scene that followed. There were screams from the women, and some panic as they rushed from the room. He did not live more than 15 minutes. Moreau left the rest in the hands of Larkin and the coroner. We walked home through the park, breathing clean air and sunshine to clear our souls of the unwholesomeness with which we had been steeped since morning. "You know," said Merrow, "he would have slipped away with the whole thing right under our noses if he had not described the woman who stared at him as having been dressed in a dark brown dress." And that was the last I ever heard Merrill mention of the affair, for it was his custom to forget these things as soon as his part had been played. End of The Dark Brown Dress by Meredith Beyers. Thank you so much for hanging out today. My name is Saul, and this is the Pulp Archive. Now, if you had fun, I'd appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, comment, and share. That stuff really helps. And like most stories we cover here, today's was recommended by you. So, if there's a story you'd like to see, send us an email at pulparchivelibrary@gmail.com. We'd love to cover it. If you'd like to support the podcast and keep us going, consider subscribing to our Apple channel or becoming a member on Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/pulparchive. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get access to all our podcasts and private explicit episodes that wouldn't be allowed publicly. We feature almost every genre of pulp fiction: horror, detective, western, and even sports. Special thanks to our patrons who make the podcast possible and make every episode of the Pulp Archive happen. Every episode is dedicated to our Patreon members. I truly could not do this without you.